Welcome to another short video to help you as you go through the reading assignments. This one is for the readings and the work you've been doing for classes 5 and 6, which is looking at direct consumer laws, communicating with consumers by email, text, and call. I'll also throw in a little bit of fax stuff, but this is definitely content that can get complicated and that overlaps. So first, email, we have laws that exist in the United States and then elsewhere, a bunch of different countries, that impact a company's ability to send email communications. The US law is specific to email. All of the other regions that you see here, you're going to see me repeat this slide, a little bit different, but a repeat, because these countries' laws are actually about electronic communications, which covers text message and certain types of calls. So we have laws that exist in lots of different places, as outlined in the reading, and as you can see in this. And that's for email. For text and phone call, in the United States, we have different federal laws. So the email was CAN-SPAM, federal laws for phone. So whether it's text or making phone calls are under TCPA at a federal level, enforced by the FTC, and TCF-APA, which is enforced by the FTC. We also have state laws. Some people have asked me questions about in the past, and there's been some case law around how text messages are regulated or why text messages are regulated under these laws. And text messages are regulated because they're viewed as phone calls. So there's a series of cases that say that a text message is a phone call. And with that in mind, when you're looking at the regulations, laws that apply to calls to cell phones are going to apply whether you're making a phone call, just picking up like that, or whether you're doing a text message. In the EU, we have the directive that I showed on the prior slide, which is the e-commerce directive, but then we also have GDPR, which impacts sending text messages or making phone calls. And then again, as I mentioned, outside of the EU and the US, we have a series of digital communications laws, and those apply just like to email, they apply to phone and text. The biggest, and here's some of those, as I mentioned, I would show you that slide again. So here's some of those countries that have laws that apply when you're making phone calls or sending text messages. The biggest risk, and we will look at this in class when we think about how aggressive we are going to be when we counsel our clients, the biggest risk is really in the US, and that's why our last reading or last written assignment is about sending text messages, because this is really where we see the lawsuits. And that is if you're sending a text message or placing a robocall. Robocalls are regulated when they're made to cell phones the same way that they are regulated when you are making them when you're sending a text message. Robocalls are regulated a little bit differently, which you will have seen as you were going through the statutes. They're regulated a little bit differently if you're making a robocall or a call with pre-recorded content to a residential line. That's going to be regulated under TCPA. If you're making a call with pre-recorded content that is marketing, you also need to look at the TSR. Lots of lawsuits because the TCPA has a private right of action. So these are just a few examples on this slide of some of the lawsuits that have been filed. I think one of the things that's most interesting about these lawsuits is these are settlements, and they were settled for between 1%, 1.5% to 3% of the total statutory exposure. So if the statutory exposure is $500 for each missent text message or each violation of TCPA, you didn't get consent and this is the number of text messages you sent, that would be in the billions of dollars. And so instead you're seeing low amounts like $47 million or $6 million. Some of the settlements have been lower than that, but this is a lot of money, and it is a really big risk and exposure for clients, which is why it's the one that we're going to be focusing on for this class. So what should we do? This slide walks you through how I took all of the different requirements. So we had the laws, we had requirements that came from carriers, we had requirements that came from industry guidelines, which is the MMA guidelines. And if you take those all together for your clients, you say, coming out of that sort of sausage making is we need to clearly provide notice and we need to get consent. And then I've broken down below what the contents of the consent would look like. This is one of the ways that you could use to walk your clients through what they're supposed to do. Another thing that we did, and you did on your minute sheet, and you guys did a great job on those minute sheets, by the way, is you put together an example of a consent. And here's something that you can measure your example that you already created up against. And this is a consent that I sometimes use as an example. The language that is after the checkbox is language that has to be there in order for the consent to be valid. The underlined language is language that exists because the text message, here I'm presuming we're sending text messages, is going to be sent by auto dial, and it has marketing content. So you see in here 3 key elements, or 4 key elements, I should say. One is that I'm getting a signature, and I'm trying to get the signature under the eSign Act. It's a little debatable whether I've gotten all the way there, but I've gotten close enough for the purposes of the FCC and warding off class action attorneys. I also say that consent is not required. I also say that consent is not a condition of purchase, something that I mentioned to several of you in your minute sheets, in my comments to your minute sheets. You want to make sure you've got that other element in there. And then finally, I am being specific about what type of content, or the broad categories of content that we're going to be sending, so that someone can understand that their consent is informed. So they can understand what they're getting, so that the consent is informed. The language that you see there that is in italics, that's language that is stemming from the Mobile Marketing Association requirements. So things like data, standard text message and data rates apply, not all carriers covered, void where prohibited, being able to opt out of the message, being able to get help. You notice that I put in parentheses, you'll be sent a confirmation message, or you can email us for an alternate way to opt out. That's because we used to see, not so much anymore, but we saw a series of lawsuits that were filed because people would text stop to opt out, and then they would get an email, or they would get a text message that said, we got your request and you've been opted out. The argument was, well, I opted out, so you shouldn't have sent me the text message. So this is one way of saying, well, you're on notice, and so if you do that, you've essentially given your consent to be sent that follow-up confirmation that you've been opted out. Two questions that people often push back on, clients often push back on. One is, what if the message isn't an advertisement? If the message isn't an advertisement, then we don't need to get signed consent, so we don't have to have the signature. We don't have to have that magic underlined language, but we still need the rest of it, so it doesn't really get you that much. But if you did have it, again, you wouldn't have to have the signature. You'd still need express consent. But it does mean that we spend some time thinking about what would be a marketing message and what wouldn't be a marketing message. Again, it doesn't really get clients that much. What gets them more is if the message wasn't an auto dialer. Because if you go back and you look at TCPA, it says that we need consent if it's an auto dialed call or text message. So if it's not auto dialed, we don't fall under that requirement. The issue becomes pretty much everything is an auto dialer. And there's a series of cases that say that basically everything is going to be an auto dialer. And the way that it's written in the statute, it says any equipment that has the capacity to store or produce numbers to be called using a random or sequential number generator and to dial such numbers. So that's basically anything that has that capacity. So it could get you a lot if it wasn't an auto dialer, but it's unlikely not to be an. Couple additional comments about marketing calls as opposed to text messages. A marketing call could go to a cell phone, in which case, if it's auto dialed, if it has pre-recorded content, all those same rules apply. But if it goes to a residential line, then we might have an established business relationship that exists that will get us out of some requirements. If it goes to a regular business line, there's also more flexibility. So it's really important when we're talking to clients to understand, did you figure out what kinds of numbers you have collected? Because the laws are specific to the types of numbers that people have collected. As I mentioned, there are fax laws. Nobody thinks that they send faxes until they call up our law firm and say, we've been sued for sending marketing faxes. So companies really, truly still are doing this. A couple things to think about, and these are the types of advice that I give clients when they're thinking about gathering information, gathering phone numbers in order to send text messages or make auto dialed or pre-recorded calls. Is in your consent, make sure you're describing what you're doing, have a mechanism in place for getting consent, keep track of those consents. If you are gathering information from third parties, think through how you're going to get consent. Think about maybe, are you and the third party jointly collecting the information? And then what are you going to do in order to opt people out? And so that opt-out part transitions us to storage. So keeping track of what you said you were going to do with the information, because that will, for our clients, inform them on what you said you would do now informs us of what we can actually do. Processing or respecting opt-outs, keeping track of them, respecting them in a timely manner, sharing them among the vendors who might be sending messages out, thinking through what is the impact of this consent that I got on our related brands. So can related brands also send messages? One of the things that we talked about in class was, if someone asks to have their information deleted, are they really asking to have their information deleted, or are they asking to opt out? So these are some things for you to think about as you are going through the reading. I hope this, like the other videos, has been helpful.